I'm on the group board of the Capital Maharaja organization in Sri Lanka, a privately owned, diversified conglomerate. For the group, I oversee energy, infrastructure, government-related business, and facilitate foreign direct investment into Sri Lanka. In addition to this, I'm very fortunate to be on the board of CWEIC, and today it is an honor and an enormous privilege to have this opportunity to moderate the panel discussion on energy security, ensuring that it's affordable, accessible, and sustainable. In my role in Sri Lanka, I often engage, sometimes like in a scrum, but more akin to a wrestler, with the policymakers and state-owned utilities to help encourage better and more sustainable policy. And what I've found over the years of this engagement is that when you place energy security at the absolute focal point of your policy, you'll find that sustainable solutions are prioritized and fossil fuels only play a supportive role, particularly if they're indigenous. This is a subject that's very close to my heart because Sri Lanka wants an energy-secure nation with 100% renewable energy through complex hydro solutions, in fact, largely funded by the British government and built by British contractors, finds itself today with less than 40% renewable energy penetration, of which only 2% is solar, and in a situation of acute energy insecurity. In fact, energy poverty. This is not only a phenomenon for developing nations, we're seeing developed nations at risk too. Geopolitics, supply-side challenges, and an insatiable demand play an enormous role. And energy is the most basic raw material on on which all of our industries run. We can be more efficient, but we'll always need it in one form or another. It can never be created or destroyed. With that being said, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our eminent panelists, Mansoor Humayun, co-founder and CEO of Bbox, Greg Jackson, founder and CEO of Octopus Energy, Laura Sandys, CEO of Challenging Ideas, and Philip Hildebrand, Vice President of BlackRock. May I start with the first question? And can I address you, Laura, to start? How can we make sure that the competing goals of energy security, minimizing climate impact, and energy affordability are not in competition?
Well, I mean, I would look at certainly the decarbonisation agenda as absolutely not being in competition with affordability. I mean, we've got a massive drop in the cost of renewables. Renewables also deliver you other things that we have become a lot more sensitive to in the last year, and that includes energy security, energy resilience. I actually believe that when you start to look, and I would urge people here today who are looking at designing an energy system for their future, is that they don't try and squeeze a renewables system into a fossil fuel paradigm. Because I think what we've got is a very, very different system emerging. Renewables will require much more capital assets. The commodity will be of less value, but the capital that needs to be deployed, it needs to be decentralized and with very much designed, and I know that Mansoor and Greg are very much in this space, designed around demand, around customers, rather than the system. And it needs to be digitalized because every time you create smart system design, you reduce overall costs. So I think we've got a very exciting future of cheaper energy. The problem we have, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, is that we're going through a transition where we've got, in some ways, two systems, and we've got two price points and two sort of models which are coming together. So when we move totally decarbonized, I think we're in a very different place.
And Greg, would you agree with Laura's statements in that effect?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think we can be very optimistic about the future of energy, despite the fact that currently we're suffering from the worst energy crisis in my 51-year life. We can be optimistic about the future because the investments that societies have made in renewables have driven the cost down to the point that power from renewables, even before the crisis, was cheaper than from fossil fuels. And at the same time as we're changing the way we generate energy, we're changing the way we consume it. Electric mobility fundamentally changes our relationship with electricity, because an electric car takes 7,000 watts, an electric light bulb takes 2 watts. So in advanced economies, it's a total change for how we use our energy system. And in emerging economies, the opportunity for micro-mobility paired with cheap solar and cheap wind changes not only the ability for a home to light and refrigerate and enjoy life, but it fundamentally changes the way that cities and towns and villages will work. The technologies are the same everywhere. I think, picking up on Laura's point, it's not a like-for-like transition. In the same way that mobiles enabled countries around the world to skip expensive landlines and move straight to a better infrastructure, so we can do the same with renewables. So I think the wrestle in many rich economies between the old system as it kind of goes down and the new system as it comes up is going to be hard, but the opportunity to deploy the new solutions directly to the billions of people around the world that don't currently have access to power is huge. And Manta, you'll talk about your thing in a minute. Interestingly, the comparisons are huge. Here in the UK, we've just started working with home builders to create homes that will never have an energy bill. They have solar panels, an electric heat pump, they have a smart hot water heater, and a battery. It's all optimized, and the home will generate more electricity than it uses, and across the year, we guarantee that they'll never pay a bill. This is how we end up with secure, resilient, cheap, and carbon-free future.
Greg, if I may just follow up on that, the question is, how can governments effectively aid the private sector in scaling investment in renewable energy? And I suppose what I have to ask is, do governments really have a role, or should they leave alone and just regulate?
It's a great question. There is enormous appetite, as people in this room may know, for private sector investment in the renewable transition. But throughout the world, the barrier to deploying that investment is that there are no routes to market. Access to grids, appetite from grids to change, distribution networks, monopoly distribution networks, all mean that we cannot build the solar farms, the wind farms, the hydropower, and provide the incredibly cheap new forms of consumption for consumers. So what governments need to do is stop guarding the old world of the monopoly grids and distribution networks and open it up. Open it up to competition, open it up to contestability, and open it up to plurality. So if we want to build a wind farm near a town and the people of the town want to host a wind farm, we can give them cheap power and we're not constrained by a 10-year wait for a grid connection. That's what we need across the world.
Thank you. Philip, what fiscal policies do you think can support the multi-billion-dollar gap between existing investment and the level needed to ensure energy security while still reducing emissions?
Thank you, first of all, for having me. Great question. Laura mentioned it, transition, right? This is arguably the biggest kind of structural change of the global economy that we've ever seen in history, perhaps with the exception of introducing fossil fuels kind of in the 18th century or late 19th century. But this is a fundamental kind of change of how we operate as a global economy. And as you've both said, it's going to be long, and importantly, it needs to be fair and just, particularly with regard to the developing world. We heard a reference to it from the Prime Minister earlier today. It doesn't do us any good if we quickly decarbonize the developed world and leave the developing world behind. That will not get us to net zero. So the fair and just element of this is incredibly important. It's difficult. There's also no question in my mind, we've done a lot of work on this, that an orderly transition would be at the macro level the best macroeconomic outcome. right? So disorderly transition, in other words, if we either move way too quickly and we leave big parts of the world without energy, or we move way too slowly and we end up suffering from huge physical manifestation of risk, are both going to be much more costly in economic terms than an orderly transition. The issue, of course, is this is going to cost, as you've said, billions of dollars. Now, to answer your question, I don't see any way for this to be funded by fiscal policy. We simply do not have enough money in the treasuries, if you like, across the world to fund this transition by way of public money. So in the end, this is all about mobilizing private capital. We need to mobilize private capital, and I would say in particular, we need to see capital moving from the rich part of the world to the developing world, because that's where the biggest investment needs are in the developing world. Now, how do we do that? That's very difficult, and it gets back to fiscal policy or public money. Public money, I think, has an important role to play. Policy has a very important role to play. This is not going to be sorted out by itself. So you need the policy framework that will then allow the private capital to be mobilized into the right places, particularly into the developing world. I think, there are many things that are needed to do this. We can come back to it, but I would say that the most important dimension to me is to find ways to encourage more private capital to go into the developing world. And for that, I think we need, amongst many other things, a fundamental rethinking of the multilateral institutions, the multilateral development banks, and the World Bank in particular. The rich countries need to start to think of some equity in this, which also means you can lose some money. And you need to move away from this absolutely protected creditor status of the rich countries when they work through the multilateral development institutions. So we need to find mechanisms, basically, to reduce some risk by way of the smart use of public money in order to then mobilize the private capital. I believe this is going to be this transition is going to mean the largest reallocation of capital we've ever seen in human history. But it's not going to happen just by itself. Now, the good news is, as most recently, we're starting to see serious discussions in the Bretton Woods institutions in Washington, led by Janet Yellen, to really rethink the way some of the MDBs could work, could deploy their capital, which of course ultimately is their shareholders' capital, in order to find ways to lead to a much more aggressive mobilization of private capital in support of the transition investments that will be required, particularly in the developing world. So this is really very similar to what David Cameron talked about earlier. What we cannot allow to happen, or will never get to net zero, is a sort of entire regions of the world being left behind in this transition because they cannot attract private capital. So this is really about finding ways to ensure that we see the capital being mobilized on a sufficient scale in order to make these investments to get us to net zero.
Laura, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
No, I mean, I think it's very interesting. I mean, one thing I would warn countries not to do is to adopt wholesale the UK energy model and the regulation that goes around it. It was fine for the time. It is very, very old-fashioned. I do agree with Philip that there needs to be frameworks into which you can make those investments. But I would also urge the financial sector to understand that, and maybe this comes back to BBOX and what you're doing, and that is we need financial mechanisms that allow for smaller investments to be rolled out in multiple distributed ways. So I always say that governments and policymakers, and also often financiers, they like, my power station is bigger than your power station sort of world, right? And actually what we've got to get to is that everything is a power station. Every home, every business. And that takes different financial models and it creates, and the contracts for difference can be miniaturized. So you have a big contract for difference, but for multiple assets across different classes. I do think, we've got the burden, as Greg says, of an old-fashioned system. Do not repeat it. Shape a new, exciting system that will be more efficient, more productive, and cheaper.
Mansour, I think that transitions very well
you
into
are.
what
Absolutely. I think one of the big problems that people don't speak enough about is the fact that around 1 billion people around the world have either no access to electricity or extremely unreliable access to electricity. Roughly 3 billion people around the world have no access to clean cooking whatsoever, right? And it's extremely unfair. We live in 2022 where basically a third of mankind is living in extreme energy poverty. But therein also is a big opportunity for change and about building a better future at the same time. One of the big things in Africa that has happened is it has happened that it has leapfrogged so many times existing technology. So whether we look at telecom going from landline to mobile phones, as Greg mentioned, or the fact that payments could happen between two phones and leapfrogging the banking system. That exactly the same thing is happening in energy in Africa. And I really think what's happening in Africa is actually a blueprint for what's going to happen globally, which is the fact that each household can produce its own electricity. Each household can store its own electricity. Each household can at times share its excess electricity with its neighbor. So that the aspect of smart metering, smart control is actually something that's taking place today. In places like Rwanda, where we've been very, very fortunate to operate for the last 6-7 years, in close collaboration with the World Bank, with close collaboration with the government, we've been able to actually reach 10% of all households in the country are actually on solar, on battery, paying their own electricity bill using mobile money. So when they pay, the system turns on. When they don't pay, the system turns off. And the really interesting thing is this: the daily cost of that electricity is cheaper than what people spend on kerosene, on candles, on diesel, etc. So even at the distributed level, yes, the fact that it's not only the most obvious choice from an experience perspective, it is actually the most economic choice. But let me tell you about some of the challenges as well, because I think that the technology exists, the business models exist, etc. But in the developing world, and particularly around Africa, the perceived risk versus real risk, there's a big arbitrage. People don't understand how to risk assess investment opportunities. And especially when you go from a centralized model to a decentralized model, right, means that you have to trust the individual customer to make a payment versus the individual government to make a payment. That means a completely mindset change in terms of not just the business model, but the risk model that actually comes with that as well. And the final thing I also want to say is that energy access and poverty are extremely linked. Let me give you an example of that. When we see a household, let's say in Kenya, that did not have any electricity, I think we would all agree that it's a household that's poor. But if that household gets access to solar, has electricity, after a period of time can get access to clean cooking, it has access to a cheaper source of cooking method. One day might get access to water or smartphones or e-mobility as well one day. That household might not be rich, but it has definitely escaped poverty. So the fact that energy access is a pathway to all access is something I see it daily in my business. And the fact that by solving energy poverty is the basis to solve poverty as a whole, I see that daily. And today we have over 4 million customers on that journey in 11 countries, but we could easily be 30 million customer, 40 million customer. The only thing that's constraining growth for companies like mine, there are other companies as well, is access to capital. The access to capital remains a very, very, very challenging proposition. You have to literally justify customer by customer. He will pay me, I promise you. And that's the way you have to aggregate up that portfolio to have access to capital. So if that perceived risk and real risk could be solved, access to capital could be made easier, and maybe some innovative solutions like carbon finance or carbon credits or other sort of credit enhancement mechanism could be flown in, as someone mentioned. I think that would be something that we can see Africa not only being fully electrified, but the first continent that is a net absorber of carbon. Right, and that is the big. I think Mother Earth will thank Africa more than a household reducing its carbon. It has an opportunity to become a net absorber of carbon as a continent, and that's what I'm particularly excited about. And I think that still remains an untold story about what can happen.
Thank you, Mansour. I'm going to ask Philip, and then Greg, if you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts on prosumers as well immediately after. Mansour raised that access to capital is one of the biggest challenges, obviously, in developing markets and transitioning into renewables. Is there appetite for financial institutions, private equity, given minimum ticket sizes and investment thresholds in distributed grid installations, as well as appetite for currency risk and credit worthiness of individual prosumers? And how does one sort of, get around the barrier to raising capital for that kind of activity?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely appetite. If you look at every single discussion, every meeting you go to internationally now as part of the financial markets is ultimately about the transition. The difficulty is kind of bringing the capital to this new system that you've described very nicely is a big challenge. We've also seen a wholesale change of the financial system. It used to be, when I started out in this industry, most of the capital came from the banks. Right? So you had a very bank-focused financial system that invested into the world, not least into the emerging world, and then you've had a series of crises, new regulation. As a result of it, today we have a completely different financial system, which is really capital markets driven. Banks find it very difficult now to lend into these types of projects, given all the regulation that have emerged after the multiple financial crises we've seen in the last 20, 30 years. So what does that mean? When we say capital markets, what does that really mean? Well, it means it's savers. So I'll give you an example from our own statistics. We're the largest asset manager in the world. More than half of the assets that we manage are pension assets. So these are either current retirees or future retirees who've entrusted us through their pension plans, managing that money. You can imagine that moving that money into a kind of highly decentralized, often quite risky, particularly when you're looking at the developing world, that's a very difficult challenge, and that's where the system is blocked currently. And I think that's the critical challenge in funding all this. So when you say private equity funds, that sounds great, but private equity capital comes from pension funds, right, to a large extent. Sometimes it comes from, high net worth individuals who may have a different risk appetite. But this fundamental kind of problem, how do we have, in a sense, a system that's evolved so rapidly, and then we have a financial system, and how do you match these two things? I think that's the principal challenge in terms of funding this transition. And that's where I think, some form of public policy, of the smart use of public money in order to incentivize, take out some of the risk, incentivize these investments back into these types of new structures so that you can essentially, what this is really all about is you kind of reduce the risk or you elevate the returns so that by way of using public money in a smart way, you recreate a kind of OECD-like risk-return profile so that you can then tap into these large pools of savings that largely come from retirees. But at the moment, we have these two systems that are not matched up very well. And this is where, I think the system is really struggling to get the capital flowing. So the appetite, yes, but how to connect the systems, as it were, is a real challenge, which is why what does well is small projects. You have, small venture firms that do certain things, or you have charitable capital that can do this on a small scale. But how we scale all this up, I think, is the real challenge.
Thank you. Greg, what role do you think companies like Octopus play in being the bridge between the prosumers, the installations, and attracting institutional capital and de-risking individual small projects in that effort to have a decentralized grid?
Yeah, I think you ended on a critical point there, which is heading towards a decentralized grid. The reality of our grids today is that they were built around the physical characteristics of coal power stations, maybe a bit of nuclear and a bit of hydro. But basically, they were built around the idea that you can turn a power station on and off to meet whatever the off-taker, otherwise known as a consumer, demanded at any given time. In a world of renewables, many people worry that the intermittency of renewables is a problem because they're used to a world in which, as a grid operator or a generator, you're in control of your production far more than you are in a world of renewables. But in the old world, the generators and the grid operators had no real understanding of the consumer. They kind of knew how much electricity was coming out of the system at any given time, but that was it. It was almost like having a road system, and then fundamentally, as you're changing the way transport works, not understanding how commuters use the roads and how freight uses the roads. And I think the reality is we need to understand how consumers use power, what they're using it for, what they're using it for before and what they're going to use it for now. Because then we can ensure that they get the benefit of the fact that when it's windy, when it's sunny, we've got the cheapest power we've ever had, and it will get cheaper every year. And the more we give them the benefits of that, to live the lives they want to live, to use the power the way that suits the characteristics of the new system, the way they change it will totally change. The way they use it will totally change. And that's why this importance of the smart grid, the smart meter, smart pricing, smart devices is so important. If you look at a rich economy, people will turn their dishwasher on at 5:30 or 6 in the evening because that's when they finish their dinner. But actually, if it made their power cheap or even free to run it at 8 p.m., they'd be delighted. And certainly with things like electric cars, the kind of thing Octopus do today is we've got tens of thousands of electric cars now where we optimize the charging on a per household basis, looking at real-time grids, weather, and other characteristics, other uses in the home and in their street. Every household has a different charging schedule. They don't care. They just plug their car in. We work it out in the background. We need to move to a world where you have that degree of smart behind kind of the way in which consumers are pulling the energy. So if they don't want to think about it, they don't have to. But we're making the most of this entirely different physical system. Now, I think what's really fascinating about B-Box, for example, is you're building from the ground up. So instead of looking at a grid and saying, when are we going to pull the power, when's it available, how much does it cost? You meet the needs of a household, and then you share the excess. Essentially, you're building a decentralized grid by starting with what really matters, which is the consumer, and then heading towards the system. And I think we're going to meet in the middle. So in rich countries, we're increasingly saying, how do we change the way that people use their energy to make the most of the new forms of generation? But the grid is going to get reinvented as we do it. And in countries where you're starting decentralized, they're going to build towards the same grid. So I think over the next 10 or 15 years, that'll happen. One quick comment on an orderly transition. There are so many versions of orderly and disorderly. And I think we should note two things. The first is that many of the companies, institutions that today control our energy system don't understand this stuff. Their current assets are not appropriate for this stuff. And I don't just mean their physical assets, the DNA of their people or their understanding of consumers. And on the other hand, a bit like we saw with the internet revolution, Companies and institutions that didn't exist before are going to spring from nowhere to being colossally important. And I urge policymakers to be listening to the companies that are driving change, that are bringing solutions, as well as those that currently provide them. Because after all, you wouldn't have spoken to Kodak about the future of photography. Well, you would have done, and you'd have invested in the wrong thing, right? And we risk holding back the battle against climate change. And more importantly, look, consumers around the world, in rich countries and poor ones, want cheap energy. We have access to the cheapest energy we've ever had. The only thing we've got to do is sort out the grids.
I'll come back to that in a moment. Laura?
No, I mean, just to sort of build on what Greg was saying, if you were an investor, would you be investing in IBM mainframes at this moment? No. You are investing in distributed assets, absolutely like Bbox is doing, and in many ways shaping your business model around demand. And I do quite a lot of, I was very interested in the first panel on food. I do a lot of work in the food sector. And picking up on Greg's point about intermittency, if you think about the food system, before we had refrigeration, we lost 60% of food, right? What is refrigeration and intermittent energy? Exactly the same. So you've got frozen food, which is long duration storage. You've got flash freezing, which is EV cars. The most important thing in the whole food system around elongating the commodity is the fridge in your home. Because if you didn't have a fridge in your home, your supermarket would have to be 3 times the size it is today. And that's why what you're doing, optimizing that demand in the home, is actually reducing the whole system costs. And that is what's so super exciting. If you start from my coal-fired power station is bigger than yours proposition, you will never optimize around that demand profile. And that demand will flex, and that demand will be shaped by price, by opportunity, and be in many ways in the driving seat.
Ansar, I think it's pretty clear that the panel have all decided that you are driving the way forward.
Let me put a controversial point, though, while we're at it. I think the energy transition will look quite different in different geographic and economic contexts. Let me give you my personal, the one that I emotionally battle the most with, is the aspect of clean cooking. So clean cooking, people don't have access to clean cooking across Africa and Asia and Latin America. Last year, probably 4 million women and children under the age of 5 died from inhalation of charcoal and firewood, et cetera, related diseases. It's a huge global crisis. But when you look at it, unfortunately today with solar panels and batteries, it remains mostly uneconomical to cook on that because people cook during nighttime and cooking on batteries is just so far uneconomical. So what you end up is with, you need to transition to something better. It's not perfect, it's better. So it turns out that one of the most effective solutions to clean cooking in Africa is LPG. Now that sounds quite controversial coming from a European or Western lens, right? Like, why should LPG or natural gas be a solution to any energy transition? But in fact, if you look at from the baseline, it's the journey, right? The journey is that they're using charcoal or firewood, which is prohibitively bad for health and environment. Then you transition to LPG that hopefully is better from a health perspective and definitely better from an environmental perspective. And maybe one day that leads to a pathway to a bio-LPG or alternative fuels or even hydrogen or whatever the next steps may look like. So I think one thing I'm noticing is some sort of prescriptiveness of what energy transition needs to look like because it makes sense where I am from and that needs to be applied on a global scale. I think that's really dangerous. I think one needs to really look at it from a carbon calculation perspective and make sure that that transition journey makes sense in the local context. The end goal should be what we should be aiming for. The path may look quite different, and that's something I'm getting a little bit concerned with some of the DFIs, etc., that are getting quite religious about what's carbon mitigating or not.
Mansour, do you find it a challenge to attract institutional capital? Do you require institutional capital to be able to roll out and do the projects that you're doing at a household level? and how are you overcoming those two challenges?
Look, on one side, we've been extremely successful in doing that in a space where we are. We've deployed over $400 million in capital in Africa, right? So from that perspective, we're one of the best capital mobilized companies that is doing energy transition in Africa. On the flip side, we need billions of dollars to be able to actually to fulfill the demand that actually exists, to solve the problem at the scale that it exists, etc. And yes, every 10, 20, 50, $100 million is a challenge. And one of the things that happens in the global context, if I may sort of talk about the Ukraine or the inflation or food crisis, et cetera, is that one thing that people don't often forget is that the path to escaping energy poverty is a very fragile path. The IEA just issued a report for the first time in the last 20, 30 years, I might be slightly wrong in the time scale, the number of people without electricity has increased, not reduced, as a result of household expenditure, right? So there's a reversal in trend. So there's a very large group of people that are borderline between darkness and light, quite literally, right? And that group of people, if they go into darkness, it has a generational effect. If you bring them into light, it has a generational effect as well. So I think what we need to do, especially in this more fragile era that we are in right now, is that I think this is the time to actually double down on making sure that we actually build a more sustainable bottom from which economic development can happen. And I think from that perspective, it's a very challenging time to communicate that, because a lot of governments, a lot of investors are looking at the existing portfolios, what's happening there, or more domestic issues, what's happening there. And I think you mentioned about the transition of capital that's needed from richer countries to poorer countries. That transition of capital has far greater hesitations than ever before. And I think that's something definitely we're seeing.
Laura, do you think that we can achieve our targets, our global objectives, while still delivering power to growing economies that they need to survive?
Absolutely. I mean, firstly, for all our sakes and for all our future, we have to meet these targets. This isn't a nice to have. This is not optional. This is absolutely crucial. And I take a little bit of sort of counter view on Philip, and that is that actually the transition is not going to be managed. It's not going to be straightforward. It will be quite messy. And I think we've got to lean into that, because actually the imperative is there. When you start to look at new solutions and you start to look at access to energy, which Mansour's doing in an extraordinary way, when you start to look at how we can ensure a greater equality of clean energy, then I think it is feasible, but it needs to be a much, much more important part of, in many ways, the development agenda. I mean, when we talk about, you talk about people's lives being either in the dark or in the light, I mean, what happens to children's education if they do not have light at home at night, right? How does this impact them, not just in that moment, but right the way through their lives' achievement? And I think we've got to start to understand that both energy and, to be frank, and certainly Africa is a big leader in this, communications are actually basic rights and basic needs to build any form of stable and prosperous economy.
Thank you. Philip, I'm going to come back to you for a moment. Same question, I suppose. Do you think that the world will be able to achieve their targets of delivering power to growing economies? And what would be the investment strategy that one would advise in order, to be able to propagate that?
Well, I think we have to first take stock, are we on track? And I would argue the answer is decisively no, right? I mean, one of the big debates right now in finance is it still realistic to basically operate under the kind of Paris pathway to net zero? And I think the brutal reality is we're far off track. You can look at different numbers. We saw a lot of estimates coming out of the COP, but it seems pretty clear that we are significantly off track, or probably tracking closer to between 2 and 3 degrees than anywhere near the 1.5 degrees. That means, of course, Laura, you're likely to be right ultimately. This is going to get very messy. And in a sense, messiness means sudden disruptions. We've had a flavor of what messiness looks like during COVID. In a sense, to me, this is kind of a script that we can refer to when we think about really disorderly transition, where suddenly you have things shut down, you have big disruptions right down to the social, political level. So there's an enormous amount at stake here, even in the short term, apart from the kind of longer term education that you mentioned and so forth. So it is critical. We have to, as you said, we have to get there. At the moment, we're off track. The question is what's needed to kind of re-accelerate this effort. The good news is some things are in place. We have renewable energy has fallen dramatically in cost. And frankly, through these supply shocks, including the war, we've had carbon energy has gone way up. So the green premium problem, in a sense, has disappeared. And that, of course, should spur investments. Again, it's how you get the money to where it's needed. And I think you probably need to think about scaling it down. So we've done a project, just to give you one example, a practical one, which was initiated by the French government, President Macron, to say we need to get money into Africa for renewable infrastructure spending. It can't be like, we can't think in billions, we have to start in millions. Public money was used to have what's called a first loss protection tranche put into it, catalytic capital, it was referred to. And then on the back of that, we were able to raise private money to a fund that ended up being very successfully. We raised more than $500 million in order to build renewable infrastructure locally in the emerging world, including a significant allocation in Africa. But these are small projects in relative terms. These are not billions and billions of dollars. And again, how do you get big pension money into projects that are in the millions, not in the billions? But I think that's what we have to do. My guess is in line with the way you described the future of the energy system, we have to kind of create investment funds, in a sense, vehicles that have some risk reduction in it through smart policy, through smart use of public money, and then bring capital to match that and adjust the risk return profile so that it happens. My concern is, how do we do that at scale, right? And I think that's where the market is struggling. And the scales involved, if you look at the estimates that many smart people come up with now, we're talking trillions of dollars every year for years and years to come. And how do we create these type? I know how to create the structure at a level of a couple hundred millions. But how do I create a structure like that at the level of billions, let alone trillions? I think that's the kind of, that's the historic challenge we face, and we're a long way from having solved that. In the end, I think the big question will be, you raised this, will the innovation come from the disruptors or from the incumbents? I see a lot of, maybe you see this more pessimistically, but I see a lot of focus of the big energy companies, that have thousands and thousands of engineers to kind of reimagine the future world. And I think it's an open question. We're seeing this play out in finance right now. We were convinced, many of us, that disruption would come from the disruptors. The incumbents would lose. When you look at what's happened in the crypto space in the last few weeks and months, maybe that's not so clear anymore. So I think this question of who will actually bring the solutions, will it be the disruptors, bottom up, the kind of examples we're hearing here, or will it ultimately be, will the carbon companies be a big part of it, that kind of reinvent their own future, in a sense, by putting to work the enormous resources they have? And remember, they're making enormous amount of profits right now. So in principle, they have a lot of capital to invest. And to me, this is one of the real big questions. Who will be the winners, the disruptors or the incumbents? I think it's an open question.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to wrap up very soon. Would any of the panelists like to make one last closing remark before I thank everyone?
I should pick up on the incumbents versus disruptors. I mean, first of all, it's true that thanks to the horrific war in Ukraine, and prior to that, the global supply chain shortages, that incumbents who own fossil fuel production are making phenomenal profits. I note that a lot of that is being spent on buybacks because they don't have the plans for the future. I think the battle between incumbents and challengers or innovators, it'll probably end up a bit like what happened in airlines, which is low-cost, highly efficient airlines around the world. Some of them with outstanding customer service, others with different propositions, grew to true scale. Incumbents went through a period of transformation, consolidation, and some bankruptcies and some mergers. And you ended up in a world where today there are large airlines that start in both places. I think that's what we'll see among companies. But I think the challenge is what happened in airlines. If policymakers had spoken to the incumbents, they'd have backed a very, very different view of the future than if they watched what happened in the market, the battle between the challengers that had new models and the incumbents that were forced to learn from those models on things like operating efficiency, intelligent approaches to capital, and actually delivering what consumers wanted. And I think you have to look very, very hard to find any incumbents at scale in any global industry who've actually driven change and who've anticipated correctly where change was going to go. So whatever you do, you need routes to market for the challenger ideas because they're going to be the pathfinders.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank, first of all, wonderful audience for being with us today, and the eminent panelists. I'd like to thank Mansour, Greg, Laura, and Philip for making for amazing discussion, fascinating discussion, hopefully to be continued in the next room. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
That was fun.
Thank you.